Passage. This week we have our 3 chapters before we get to the before we take a break and switch over into Ruth. As far as what these 3 chapters are, it's before the boring part of the book of Joshua, where then you just get the lists of things, and you even kind of start the list this week. But chapters 12 through 22, it's very much the tribe of Judah was given this land, and these cities were given to this person and his family, and this is where so-and-so settled, and they remained there to this day. And so I figured we probably should take a break and go over and look at Ruth before we get there. But this morning we are wrapping up this first section of Joshua. And one of the main focuses is Joshua is following the things that have been commanded of him, by Moses. Moses left commands for Joshua to follow because God commanded Moses to do these things. And I want us to sit here and think for a minute. What are some of the instructions we follow in our lives, in our church? Is it the 10 Commandments, the Great Commission, the greatest commands? Is there a parable that we are drawn to? What are some of those examples that we follow as Christians? Maybe it's a little bit more easier to think of it as what are some of the practices we are taught to do? Because I could list a whole lot more of the practices. Things like the Lord's Supper, baptism, feeding the hungry, giving to the poor, supporting missions, and we can continue on the list of all the things that the New Testament, and even going back into the Old Testament, we as followers of God are commanded to do. Now this week, what we see is kind of we're picking up, and this isn't the first time Joshua is following the commandments that God has done. And sometimes, as we've seen, they've struggled to follow these commands. Right? They weren't always quick to follow what God had asked them to do. Just last week, we looked at how they sometimes put the cart before the horse. They were ready to rush in. God, okay, we already know the instructions. You don't have to give us details for every step. We can just do it. And, well, no, you can't. You're missing the steps, and you're going to lose at the Battle of Ai the first time. You're putting the cart before the horse, and it's not new. When the Israelites are going into the land under Moses and they send out the spies, God has given them instructions. Go into the land, conquer it, make it your own, drive out the people before you. And the people say, no, your instructions, your commands, God, we believe you, but these guys are actual giants. How can we go up and fight actual giants, God? We're normal-sized people. Then further on, you see Moses kind of does the same thing with the story of him striking the rock the second time. And it's always been a weird story of, well, why did Moses get in trouble for calling water from the rock? Wasn't there a story before where he was supposed to strike the rock and water was supposed to come out? Well, yes, but the second time, God said, talk to the rock and the water will come out. Don't strike the rock. And so he gets in trouble because he says, God, I think I know what you're asking. I'm not going to pay attention anymore. I'm just going to do it. Achan did the same thing when he stole from the ruins of Jericho. I know what has been commanded of me, but is it really important that I follow the commands? And as I already mentioned, the first attack of Ai, I know how I'm supposed to be concerned with the conquest of Canaan, according to what God has commanded and given instructions about. But it would be just easier because I kind of already know what he's going to say, so I'm just going to do it. And it gets into that area of you're jumping to conclusions. You're assuming you know what God wants, but in reality, you have no idea. And in chapter 9, we see an example of the Israelites not following the instructions of God that God gave them. And so I'll go ahead and read from Joshua chapter 9. It will be the whole chapter, so bear with me. As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country, and in the lowland, all along the coast of the Great Sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. But the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai. They, on their part, acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes, and all of their provisions were dry and crumbling. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you live among us. Then how can we make a covenant with you?" They said to Joshua, "We are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" And they said to him, "From a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to the king of Heshbon, and to Og the king of Bashan, who lived in Asheroth." So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, "Take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them, and say to them, 'We are your servants. Come, warm.'" What? Oh, I skipped one. "Come now, make a covenant with us. Here is our bread. It is still warm when we took it out from the houses of our food for the journey and on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbling. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey." So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them, and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders in the congregation swore to them. At the end of 3 days after they had made the covenant with them, they heard that they were among the neighbors that lived among them. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities, and on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Shephiron, Beeroth, and Kiriath-Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath that was sworn to them." And the leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said to them. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, "Why did you deceive us, saying, 'We are very far from you,' when you actually dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood and drawers of water, for the house of my God." They answered Joshua, "Because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and destroy the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. Now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good, whatever seems right in your sight, do it to us." So we did this to them, and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua had made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in this place that he should choose. So that's a very long story to say the Israelites once again did not talk to God before making a decision. And that led them to be deceived. Now this story kind of gives us it's important in chapter 10, of course, because chapter 10 comes after chapter 9. It's not important in chapter 8 because it hasn't happened yet. But in chapter 10, we'll see the kings surrounding Gibeon will say, whoa, 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 whoa. Israel, this almost unstoppable force, has now allied with Gibeon. Gibeon must be destroyed. Which shows they don't understand what just happened. They clearly did not hear how the men of Gibeon went up and begged Israel for a covenant. And how they had to deceive Israel into allowing them to stay. And so here in chapter 9, once again, we hear how the feats of Israel has gone out before them. The word of what has happened, the story has already gone out. The legacy of what these people are doing in the land and who their God is preceding them. Is doing most of the grunt work for them. Because again, what we'll see in chapter 10 is God's power is destroying more of the enemies of Israel than Israel is actually killing. And the same thing is probably happening as the word is coming through these cities. Surely some of these Canaanites are sitting here saying, we got to pack up and leave. We cannot be here when the Israelites get here. We have to find somewhere else to be. We cannot inhabit this land anymore. And so they leave, and then they find themselves at the will of the wilderness. They're now the one in the wilderness, but without God, they're wandering, and they don't have manna coming from heaven. They don't have quail being sent to them like the Israelites did. They are now shriveling up and dying out in the wilderness. However, as we see in chapter 9, back to the deception part, Israel has repeated this mistake over and over and over again. They'll actually continue to make this mistake over and over and over again. Because what they're doing is God has given them commands. You have made a covenant with me. You just renewed the covenant a couple chapters ago. And here we are having to be reminded of why you're in the land. You're not in the land to make friends. It'd be nice, but no, you're here to drive out the enemies of God. You are to bring destruction upon the wicked people of Canaan. You are to burn the things that are devoted to destruction. And then what they end up doing is making a covenant with their neighbors, invoking God to bind it. Now, we don't have a whole lot of covenant relationships anymore, but one of the main ones that we still have is marriage. In marriage, you're asking, a man and a woman are asking God to bind them together for eternity. And they're asking the help of the congregation as witnesses to ensure that they never break that covenant. If we think of what the Gibeonites and the Israelites are doing as a marriage, I think it kind of simplifies the analogy. They are asking God, we are asking you to bless this relationship between the Gibeonites and the Israelites. And you are binding us together, not to be broken apart. There's no matter in which, in the eyes of God, we are now can be separated. And we're asking everyone who's around us, all our followers as Israelites and Gibeonites, have to now bear witness to this idea of we as leaders cannot go against each other. We are connected by God. And so it's, once again, it's referenced several times in chapter 9 of, well, you're supposed to go destroy the Gibeonites. Well, we can't. We told God we wouldn't. Which is kind of weird that you're now telling God which people you won't destroy, whether it's you're being deceived or not. But you're saying, God, I know you gave us a list of these are the people we are going to go out and destroy. But we're not going to go out and destroy the Gibeonites because we've made a covenant with them. We said that we wouldn't because they deceived us. Well, deception or not, you still promised not to destroy them. You still promised by God not to destroy them. And I want us to think about the times we're deceived as people. Deception still happens. It's not like everyone just started telling the truth for all of history. There's still lies. There's still deception in our world. I think that sometimes we're deceived in the same way. We allow ourselves to hear a story, and we hear a story that sounds so easy. Oh, sure, I'm going to promise not to attack someone who's far off. Someone who's like well They are so afraid of us that from so far off that they're coming to us, begging us not to attack. Someone is so desperate or acting so desperate and asking for help. Of course I want to help them. Now, I'm not saying everyone who's begged is trying to deceive us. But we always have those stories of it's someone who's begging and yet they are living right next door and better than they let on. And I want us to think about this deception that the Gibeonites did with the Israelites surely affected the relationship with Israel and God. Because once again, you were deceived because you didn't look to God. You didn't ask God the questions. You didn't say, God, we're in the middle of this land. We have visitors among us. Surely we should consult God, the one who's been giving us the instructions, who's been able to see through all of the mistakes we've done. Surely we should ask him what we should do. Nope, not what the Israelites did. They said, all right, we're done. Let's just move on. We know what's best. I think when we're deceived, we do the same thing, right? We say, God, we don't need to listen to you even though you know everything. You've seen everything. You are everywhere, and you are well able to tell me who this person is, what's going on. And yet, we don't. We allow ourselves to think, I don't need God to tell me how to act. I don't need God to hold my hand. I'm a grown-up. I don't need to be babied anymore. I don't need the help of an older, wiser adult. I don't need the help of someone else nudging me along. I got it. I can do it by myself. And I don't know, I know a lot of people want to say, well, that's American culture. Well, no, because this happened in the Bible, and the United States was founded almost 4,000 years later. Like, it's not anything like our American culture. This is human nature. It's human nature to say, I don't want to listen to what others have to say. I want to do it my way. Now, American culture has not helped that. We have definitely taken off the training wheels even more and said, yeah, well, let's just do whatever we want at times, which is not always the greatest because it puts us against God. With that in mind, I want us to see how this relationship between the Gibeonites and this deception that how they deceived the Israelites affects this relationship in chapter 10. Because in chapter 10, there's 5 main kings of the Amorites who come up to battle. And they are ready to go attack Gibeon. And you have to sit there and think, something else is happening here than just 5 kings started getting worried. So we'll go ahead and read chapter 10, verses 1 through 15. As soon as Adonizek, the king of Jerusalem, heard Joshua had captured Ai and devoted it to destruction, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel, and they were among them, he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So Adonizek, the king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoam, the king of Hebron, to Piram, the king of Jermuth, to Japhia, king of Lachish, to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come to me and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the people of Israel. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites and the kings of Jerusalem, and the king of Hebron, and the king of Jermuth, and the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon gathered their forces and went up with all of their armies and encamped against Gibeon and made war against it. And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, Do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up quickly and save us and help us, for the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us. So Joshua went up to Gilgal. He and all the people of war were with him, and the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them and suddenly marched up all night from Gilgal. And the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon, and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And they fled before Israel. While they were going down the ascent of Beth-horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed by the sword. At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord had given the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and the moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven, and did not hurry to set about a whole day. There has been no day like it, before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So Joshua returned, and all of Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. So chapter 10 opens, and it introduces us to 5 kings, and all of these kings are of Jewish towns, because they're not using the Canaanite name. And so it's just one of those interesting facts of, yeah, the king of Jerusalem, that's what he was calling his city. No, it was the king of what will become Jerusalem. We see later in David's reign that it's actually at one time named Salem, and then after the conquest, and it probably had a name before that, of Jerusalem was not the name that was given. This is a name given by the writer who's probably compiling the story or rewriting the story around the time of David. And so it's one of those interesting tidbits of, we're seeing again these cities have importance to the Jewish people. That it's not just random cities that rose up. It are cities that even now have importance to the Jews. But these kings, again, have been deceived in their own mind of thinking about what had just happened with the Gibeonites and the Israelites. They're thinking, oh, Gibeon has now made a new ally that is going to fight for Gibeon, because Gibeon's the one pulling the strings here. They're the ones welcoming these visitors, these foreigners into the land. No, that is not at all what's happening. If anything, we look at it and we see Gibeon is humbling themselves to Israel, so much so that Israel is back near the Jordan River at Gilgal, their main camp where they're at. And Gibeon has to plead for them to leave Gilgal on an emergency rush to Gibeon to come fight their battle for them. And it's just interesting to me, one, so the Israelites pick up their stuff in the evening time, and they march all the way through the night. And they get there in the day, and then they're fighting this battle, and then as the sun is starting to set, Joshua then says, all right, we need the sun to stay up in the sky for another day, and it not become night at all, so we can continue to fight. Some scholars argue that the reason why he asked the sun to stay in the sky was because of some Sabbath, or because of Sabbath was coming, which makes sense. They can't fight on the Sabbath. They're not supposed to do anything really on the Sabbath. And you can read into it as, well, here in chapter 16, the Israelites are back at Gilgal. They're back at Gilgal as they have been practicing. That's where they practice the Passover. That's where they've probably set up the tabernacle. That's where they would probably return for the Sabbath. I'm not sure what it's about, but I do know it is just interesting of, you have this fighting force who I'm sure someone's sitting here and saying, you woke us up, or we haven't gone to sleep, and now we're fighting for almost 2 days straight, and now we have to go back and do Sabbath practices in Gilgal, just to then leave again in the end of chapter 10 of, all right, now we have to go find and hunt down these kings and go destroy their cities. Joshua, can we have like a nap or like a rest or something? We've been fighting for all this time. But they don't seem to grumble. The Israelites are a grumbling people. They are very frequently grumbling and making their frustrations known. But in this battle, what you can see is also God is reminding the Gibeonites of what they have entered into as well. Gibeon is reminded very early on, you are not the one with power here. The kings that rise up against them say, well, Gibeon is a city of power. It is like one of the capital cities. It has a military, it has power, and very early on they are reminded by these kings that are probably brought up by God, saying, Gibeon, you may have thought that you're going to somehow be able to eventually twist this to where you have the upper hand. No, you will never have the upper hand in this covenant. It is Israel. You are dependent on my people. And I'm going to redeem their mistake that they made and make it work out for them. I'm going to make this mistake that they've entered into somewhat foolishly, and I'm going to make it work out for them. Remind you who's actually in charge here. Remember that you're the one who begged my people for help because you were so afraid. And so it's just one of those things of Gibeon is constantly being reminded, or not necessarily constantly, but it's being reminded. And in these cities, we see, in the battle, we see a lot of this kind of creation language. God has power over creation. He can set the sun, he can stop the sun if he wanted to. He can call down hailstones at will. And it's one of those, you kind of sit there and think, well, surely you could explain it away. Like there has to be something that we could just, some scientific, no, the sun has never sat still in the sky. It's like the star in Bethlehem. It's this great light in the sky, and it is like a star that is super close to Earth. Well, the closest star to Earth is the sun. If the sun were to be out in the middle of the night, it would be something to be kind of puzzled by, right? This is a light that is marking where the Savior is born, and it's almost like it is daylight at nighttime. Surely you can't explain that away. Because sure, you have when Jupiter and Saturn align and they reflect the sun's light, it does look bigger than a normal reflection of light. Sure. But this is not something that can just be explained away. The sun has never sat still in the sky. Hailstones have never really just randomly fallen out of the sky, specifically attacking certain people, right? It's not just randomly falling to where Israelites are also being struck by hailstones. It's specifically the armies of these Amorite kings who are being struck. It is specifically them who are being struck down by hailstones. I don't know about you, but if we were to have a thunderstorm this evening and hailstones were to be falling down, everyone's car would be getting hit no matter who they were, right? No matter who you were and no matter what it was, hailstones would still fall on everything. It would hit trees, it would hit our building, it would hit cars. Unless you had gone up here early enough to park under the carport, you're not being spared from the hailstones hitting your car, right? However, in this situation, it is hitting specific people. It is only hitting these Amorite kings. It is only doing this, and once again, we can't help but notice, this is not luck. This isn't some fluke of nature. It is God and his presence being made known through creation. He has power over the seas, over the water, over food that shows up in the wilderness, over the different signs of how he has made himself known again and again and again. It's not some random occurrence. God has made himself known to these people. And I think it's also interesting, he's made himself known in all these ways, and yet there's still some who will doubt. There are still some who sit there and say, is this really the commandment that God has given me? Well, it's no different. When Christ comes onto the scene, We have disciples who have seen the miracles of what has happened. They have followed Jesus. They have seen him teach, and they still sit there and think, okay, but is he really the Messiah, or is he just a good preacher? Is he really the Messiah? Is he really my salvation, or has he just got a lot of really good things to say? You sat there and witnessed it. He turned water into wine. Water doesn't just randomly turn into wine. He healed people who had been blind for years, who had been lame for years, who had not been able to speak, who had not been able to walk, who had actually died, and you witnessed it, and you still had doubts. It's no different in Joshua's time. Now, it's not God as flesh who is standing among them doing these things. It is God sitting up and in his throne in heaven doing these things for you, before you. But it's still one of those, hailstones don't just randomly fall exclusively on your enemies. And then we'll see in chapter 10, verses 16 through 18, after this defeat, the kings of in the valley of Ajalon, the Amorites' kings are captured, and they're sealed in a cave. And they roll a stone in front of it, and later they're beaten, subjugated, and hung on a tree before being killed and thrown back into the cave. I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of weird. It's happened again. We had the king of Ai, and now we have these Amorite kings. And you have this imagery that's coming back to us of the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. I like to think we're not reading the crucifixion into it. We're reading these stories into the crucifixion. As a Jew, surely reading the story of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is hung on a tree and he is put in a cave and is rolled in front of, that is not how you treat the Messiah. That's not how a king dies. That is how an enemy king dies. That's how one of the Canaanite kings die. How are we treating, why is our king supposed to be the one who ends up on the tree, who's beaten, who's berated, who is whipped, who is tortured, and then buried in a cave with a stone rolled in front of it? I think sometimes we'll read the gospel and then we'll read this story and we say, oh, so there must be something elevated about them. No, it is the story of Christ. He is humbling himself to the point of he is dying like these kings. He's being tortured like people who had been devoted to destruction by God. He is allowing himself to be treated that way for us. And that is how I take that story. Because you also see the Israelites are quick to conquer these devoted, and another, I guess, tone. These cities don't really stand up for much, I guess, resistance to the Israelites. We're now getting to the part of the story where Joshua, or the writer of Joshua, doesn't think, yeah, okay, we don't need to tell how all these cities fell. And so they just fall pretty quickly. Because even then, into the end of chapter 10 and chapter 11, we start to see all of these cities of the south and north are being listed and how they are being destroyed. And again, it brings up this idea of every single one of them is being devoted to destruction. It is not just the sinners. It's not just, or the ones who are actively partaking in sin. It's those who have been in this sinful culture. It is everyone and everything is being devoted to destruction. Which again, brings up some unpleasant feelings, right? We like to think, well, surely there was someone innocent. But then again, we also don't know what was happening when the Israelites were in Egypt or when they were in the wilderness. Generations have risen and fallen in that time. It is no longer the neighbors that surrounded Jacob and Joseph in this land back when they first bought those plots of land so many generations ago. And the way I thought of it, and not to beat my own drum or whatever, or maybe it's toot my own horn, but It's one of those, I thought of this last week after class. What we're seeing is not the story from a third-person perspective. We're not seeing both the Israelite side and the Canaanite side and God's side. We're not watching this from a side. We are watching it from Israel's point of view. We are seeing it from Israel's point of view. They're hearing what God is hearing, and they're seeing what they're supposed to be doing to the Canaanites. And as we think about it, Israel is being used as a tool. And so the way I thought of it is, we're seeing it from the point of view of the hammer. If we were to build a fence, what the hammer is doing seems destructive to the nails. Right? It is driving these nails and it's beating them, it is crushing them, whatever, however you want to describe it, but we are seeing it from the point of view of the hammer. We are doing terrible things to the nails, but we're not realizing what the guy who's holding the hammer is actually doing in this time. We're not seeing the things that it kind of crumbles apart at this point because the nails have done something deserving of destruction. But it's one of those, the hammer looks brutal. What is it doing? But when you step back, the hammer's building a fence. It's building something. Israel is building a nation of God, and it is seeing, and we're not seeing it from the carpenter's perspective. We're not seeing it from God's perspective. God is seeing it as, I am getting rid of these terrible people who have done nothing but harm my creation, who have gone against my will and what I have set out for people in my land. They have shown no respect to anything I have established. I have raised up these people, Israel, to drive these people out, to be my representative, to be my tool of justice in the world at this time. Because God does the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar. He does the same thing with Cyrus. He has raised up at times different people to be the hand of justice for him. Sometimes it's justice against Israel. Sometimes it's justice for Israel. But it's all the same. God has led these people into the land and has allowed them to conquer Canaan. However, next week we are starting Ruth. And so this story will need to be put on the back burner for a while. But we will jump into Ruth. It's not necessarily chronologically how it's supposed to happen. Ruth happens after the conquest. But it is still one of those moments where you have to sit there and think, these stories are connected. And the message is the same. So that's what I have. We'll be in Ruth 1 next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good.